We are joined with the one, the only Warwick Powell. How you doing this evening, Warwick?
I'm okay, Jamal. We're slowly but surely getting our time zones and days in sync with each other.
Are we? So I am now in Baku, Azerbaijan. So we are getting further and further apart in regards to our time zone. It's 4:15 here. I think it's what 9 o'clock there, 9:15.
10 o'clock. 10.
10 o'clock. Oh, Jesus. Yeah, we're getting further and further apart. Our skies are unmooring from each other now. But Warwick Powell, he's an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. He's chairman of Smart Trade Networks Group of Companies and president of Data Integrity and Supply Chain Association, Inc. Warwick, I'm so glad that you could join me. This article came out. Where is it? Right here. This article came out yesterday. Well, I guess it was a few days ago. Even though it took place apparently in November, which is weird that it's only now coming out. This part came out in Telegraph, but I think it first was posted in the Wall Street Journal. U.S. Special Ops intercepted Chinese military shipment headed to Iran. U.S. officials says the cargo was bound for Iranian companies to acquire parts for Tehran missile program. Okay, again, I asked who the F are you, and why does that concern you? But this gives a little bit more details. U.S. forces stormed cargo ship traveling from China to Iran. Now, there have been policy papers, and I'm going to credit Brian Beletic for bringing this up, with this idea of engaging China to go after shipping, to effectively interdict ships that are headed from China to other locations as a way to stem China's biggest advantage, which is effectively trade and their ability to trade with other nations of the planet. The belief being, well, if we can inhibit and cripple their ability to trade with countries, we can cripple the country as a whole, slowing down China's progress in economic and industrial dominance. And whether it's interdicting this ship, whether it's blocking the ship from Russia going to Venezuela, whether it's stealing the oil that was being shipped from, I believe, from Venezuela to Iran, all of these are cases of the U.S. effectively using that particular policy with the idea that the U.S. may be revving up for that policy on a global stage against China. For one, let's step into this. Give me your thoughts on this first, and then we can go into this kind of larger question of, do you think this is effectively what is taking place currently?
Well, I think the first thing we can say about all of this, Jamal, is that if it is true, and let's not forget that there have been no responses from either the Chinese side or the Iranian side. So these are reports based on comments made, apparently unnamed comments from American officials. Let's assume that it's true for the time being. I think it is clear that the Americans are, again, testing the waters, so to speak, and seeing what they can get away with. The issue, of course, is that whenever the United States has undertaken these sorts of provocations in the past as a means of testing the water, the standard response from those that they are testing is literally silence and a non-reaction.
Right.
The other side rarely gets provoked into making too much out of these sorts of incidents, and certainly rarely will they respond in a like-for-like manner. This leads the US, particularly its analytical apparatuses, to reach the conclusion that this lack of response and lack of action is tantamount to weakness.
Yes.
Nothing could be further from the truth. This kind of analytical frame and interpretive methodology has consistently led the United States to underestimate those who it believes are its adversaries and mistake the unwillingness of the counterparty to be lured into these sorts of tit-for-tat games as a sign that the counterparty is unable to engage in sustained pushback if the need ever arose. So I think that that's probably the first thing to note about all of this. The second thing, which is more broadly speaking, is that if this is a serious strategy, then given the asymmetries between the volume of Chinese ships that travel the oceans carrying cargo and the capacity, the scale of the US Navy, we're really entering into an arena where I think we could call it a case of whack-a-mole. There simply isn't enough American naval capacity ultimately to cause massive disruptions to the course of maritime trade. The only time it can really cause significant disruptions to maritime trade is not really through interceptions in the open ocean, but it's through control over choke points. The third thing I think we can observe, particularly in relation to the China-Iran trade dimension, is that should the assessment be made that maritime trade is going to be fraught, then more trade, more movement of goods between China and Iran will take place via the overland rail routes. And we are already seeing an expansion of trade across the rail between China and Iran, and this will certainly continue. If the US thinks it's going to be in a position to intercept all of these, well, I think we are going to see both material constraints. There's only so many resources available. But in the end, also, I think heightened risk of considerable pushback by countries whose territories are traversed by these rail lines as they travel from China all the way through Central Asia and ultimately into Iran. So if the reports are true that this is what the Americans are up to once again, then they are, I think, treading on dangerous territory.
China, Russia, Iran, all of these countries know at this point that the framework that the United States looks at this, and the Europeans either also, are weakness, meaning a non-response is always considered weakness. If they know that, why isn't the action more vigorous in the very beginning? Meaning, if this trial balloon goes up, and regardless of your own framing of it, meaning the way you look at it, like this is always, I used to have this conversation with KJ about the difference between somebody who plays chess versus somebody who plays Go. And he would make this point of saying, well, China plays Go, they don't play chess. Yeah, but the problem with chess logic is it forces you into a very similar framework of logic. Meaning, a person may be brilliant, but if I can punch them and take their lunch money, how brilliant they are doesn't necessarily matter in the moment. If my framing is set in this, and in this world, your inaction is weakness, shouldn't the response be action in the very beginning or aggression in the very beginning in order to say this is a no-no, this is a fail, this is not something that is going to be allowed to go forward? Or is that just not the way China looks at this?
Well, I don't think it is how China looks at it. I think China firstly sees itself as a country, and others will have a different view about this, of course, but China sees itself as a country that upholds international law and seeks to conduct itself accordingly. So the first thing it does is respond to the situation in accordance with what it believes is an appropriate reference to international law. The reasons it does that is, of course, partly political, because it is about demonstrating to others in the world that China is a responsible major actor. So if it allowed itself to be drawn into these sorts of contests on similar terms or on the same terms that the Americans, appear to want to draw people towards, then in many regards, it's lost the argument anyway. So if there are those who say that the international relations world is nothing more than the law of the jungle, and China says, well, no, we think that there is a need for countries to come together around a set of rules, international law, in other words, and custom and practice, and conduct their relations with each other accordingly, then in many ways, it's just got to walk the walk. Now, that could be seen to be disadvantageous, but only in the sense that it refuses to be drawn into the sort of schoolyard fisticuffs.
Yeah.
Does this lead to a long-run disadvantage? Well, look, I think that there is a recent parallel that we can take a look at. And of course, it's a terrible parallel, but one which I think exemplifies the dynamics at work. And that is, of course, what's been going on in Ukraine, where a whole range of efforts over many years to frame the concerns around Russian security and push back on NATO expansion and those sorts of things ultimately resulted in nothing. But we now have a conflict, and that's been going on for 4 years. And I don't think that that was actually the preferred outcome, actually, of either the Russians or the Ukrainians, for that matter. But in the end, they were drawn into it. Now, that is always a risk, that trying to conduct yourself in a way that doesn't slip into the law of the jungle style of behavior. It isn't perfect, and you can be drawn into it. But look, China's a big country, and I think for now it certainly has the view that it can hold its own, and it's not going to waste too much firepower, so to speak, either diplomatically or in kinetic terms, in response to a particular incident like this. The other thing to remember is that as much as these are tests that the Americans are conducting, they are also opportunities for China to evaluate the modus operandi and capability of American resources. And there is no doubt that China and Iran and others will take these opportunities to learn a lot about how the United States plans and goes about executing these sorts of initiatives, shall we say. And that enables them to ultimately be much better placed in the future in the event that something far more serious emerges. But piracy by the Americans has re-emerged as part of our landscape. I think the rest of the world needs to see American piracy for what it is very clearly. It's happening at the same time as American violence on the oceans in and around Venezuela, where ships, boats are being blown out of the water and people are being murdered unlawfully. And the contrast is clear for everyone to see, that the claims that America perhaps was able to once make with a little bit more persuasive power of being a global leader and a bastion of behavioral rectitude is no longer the reality of America today, if in fact it ever was the reality of America.
What will be the Chinese response if they do indeed go with this idea of choke points?
Look, China has for well over 20 years, in fact going back further, but Hu Jintao, a former Chinese president, was acutely aware of particularly the choke points around the Malacca Straits, which is the body of water adjacent to Malaysia and coming around the south of Singapore. Now, that particular body of water is one in which military vessels could fulfill a blockade, but the concerns were particularly apparent around the turn of this century. And of course, at that time, the US Navy, in relative terms, was significantly stronger than the Chinese Navy. So there was no doubt at that point in time that the balance of naval power, particularly in that body of water, was in America's favor. The other thing to look out for in all of this is the South China Sea, because once you come through the Straits of Malacca, coming east and heading around Singapore, you come up into the South China Sea. And the United States Navy, together with a number of its allies have consistently operated in that body of water, ostensibly under the banner of freedom of navigation, but clearly you don't do freedom of navigation movements in a body of water at the same time as dropping sonar buoys into the water to monitor submarines. But anyway, that's the PR that comes with American presence in the South China Sea, and but today China obviously has a much more significant presence in that body of water in terms of the man-made islands that it's built, and its ability to project power and to operate forcefully in that body of water, to a point where I don't think there is any doubt that the Chinese Navy is more than a match for anybody in the South China Sea. So the ability for the Americans to unilaterally intercept and create blockades in the South China Sea, I think, has diminished significantly over the course of the last 20 years. The last thing I'll say on this issue of choke points is China has implemented, I think, two main things to address these risks. One is to build alternative routes, particularly the rail lines through Eurasia. And of course, now as the Arctic ices recede and the opportunity exists to expand the Northern Arctic routes, I think we're going to start to see more options for maritime traffic there as well. The other thing to bear in mind is that much of the Straits of Malacca, from China's security perspective, is a concern, because a lot of China's crude oil comes through there, and China's import of crude oil has slowed in recent years, and slowed appreciably because of the transformation in the structure of China's economy, intensively in the direction of electrification, so that more and more transportation in the out years is going to be fueled by electricity, whether it's in passenger motor vehicles, but also increasingly in freight transport on roads, and also with the release of ocean-going battery-powered vessels. So, there've been quite a number of initiatives to reduce the risk of these choke points being critical.
One last question in regards to, let's say, trade. The fact that the U.S. has effectively blocked a Russian ship that was going to Venezuela, and that the United States has effectively hijacked a ship going from, I think it was Venezuela to Iran. Is there any concern that, let's say, the trade relationship between between China and Venezuela would also be interdicted? I mean, part of the national security strategy that Donald Trump came up with was, on some level, retrenchment. This idea that the U.S. was going to control, like a Monroe Doctrine 2.0, that we wanted to control effectively South America, and that we didn't necessarily like the fact that South America and sovereign states of South America was working with Iran, China, Russia, etc., and that the United States wanted to be the principal, let's say, determinant factor in South America's relationship with the rest of the world. Now, this is outrageous. I mean, Brazil is part of BRICS, right? But if you are getting a situation where they are interdicting Russian ships and ships dealing with Iran, why wouldn't they do the same with China and its relationship with Venezuela? Or is that a concern for China at this point?
Look, I think China will be monitoring it closely, right, to see whether or not it becomes a repeating pattern. I wouldn't doubt that there aren't back-channel discussions taking place as a result of these sorts of events, because one of the things that great powers seek to avoid is miscalculation as well. It's important to not allow single events to escalate out of control to a point where you end up with kinetic conflict between two great powers. So attempts, I think, will be made to gauge precisely what the intentions are and what the likely intentions are going forward in relation to American naval activities, insofar as Chinese commercial cargo vessels are concerned, as they ply their trade in and out of Latin America. mean, let's not forget too that 12 months ago, the Chancay port in Peru was opened, and that particular port opens up direct passage between Latin America and Asia across the Pacific, reducing freight times and freight costs and opening up vast markets for exporters in Latin America. Now, that, of course, has been of some concern to the United States, because ultimately that will impinge on the value of West Coast ports, because historically Latin American trading vessels have literally had to ply their way up the coast and use American ports as transshipment ports. They don't need to do that anymore. And of course, earlier this year, we had an attempt by the United States to take control of the Panama Canal, which connects the Indian Ocean side and the Pacific Ocean side. Now, those attempts have so far failed, but you can see that the United States does have designs on securing a dominating position in relation to trade, particularly with Latin America, and how Latin America interacts with the rest of the world. Whether or not that's going to succeed or not, I think, only time will tell, and it will depend on, large countries like Brazil and the extent to which they can continue to pursue their economic relationships with others in the world. And it also depends on whether or not the Americans overreach. I mean, one of the things about these sorts of activities is there is a certain point, whatever that line is, that major powers, filled with a little bit of hubris and perhaps a little bit of energetic excitement about their ability to dictate terms to someone else, ultimately leads to a strategic or tactical miscalculation, which could be a bit of not only a political blunder, but could also invite serious reaction by those major powers who are actually engaging in legitimate trade and investment in that part of the world. Lately, I've been quite fond of a very short phrase, which is "be careful what you wish for." And
Yes.
I think with a lot of these sorts of activities, as much as they are niggling and pushing the edges a little bit, the concern that I have for stability in the region, but also in terms of America's own sense of its interests, is, be careful what you wish for.
You wrote an
I've lost you there, Jamal. Hello?
There we are. I'm sorry, work. The internet
That's
flicked me. Um,
Brisbane calling Baku.
yeah, I saw. Yeah, I'm gonna have to get a hard wire to this, but for some reason they placed the router on the ceiling and the yeah, that's a whole other thing. I want you to see this. This is an article that you wrote. Ruptured Memory and Liberal Time Regime
Yeah.
Reassessing the Cultural Revolution Through a Dialectic Lens. I was fascinated by this article. And as you pointed out, there are two articles that you have also coming out after this one. And you effectively make the case that the author, let me see, then I want to get the specific name of the book that was referenced. She did an interview on Jeff Fritz's show, which was also really interesting. But that the author was looking at this through a very specific lens, Bombard the headquarters. And you called it liberal Orientalism in the way that you effectively described her take on it, saying that there was another view of the revolution as opposed to just being chaos and everything else, that this was, let's say, a cleansing of sorts, and that it could be looked at through a sense of dialectism as opposed to this liberal lens that people typically look at it through.
Yeah.
Break that down for us. And in fact, maybe, so let me explain my interest in this. In the Three Body Problem, one of my favorite books, one of my favorite series, Earth Remember Its trilogy, it all starts at the Mao Revolution. And the author, or let's say the person, the main character, or one of the main characters, who was a part of that revolution, was a child and watched her father effectively get murdered by the radicals of the revolution as they start destroying all of these, let's say, elements of the previous regime or the previous order. And her father, who was a physicist, is explaining like relativity or something. And they point out that this stuff is a Western lie. And because it's a Western lie, we are going to murder you. And they effectively beheaded the guy in front of her, put her in prison. She gets very callous about the world as a result. And when they make contact with aliens, she effectively said, "Come get us. We can't deal with our own affairs." In which case, 400 years in the future, the aliens are coming to get Earth. The interest, though, is the revolution itself and the way that some of the people who were there effectively saw that revolution, especially if they were at the bad ends of that revolution. That's my interest. That's my vector into this.
Yeah.
Explain this revolution for us. How did this come about? How did Mao Zedong effectively get power? And then we can step into, let's say, how the author of the book sees it and another way of analyzing what took place. But the first question is, how did Mao Zedong get power?
Well, Mao led the Communist Party from the 1930s onwards, and ultimately, was part of the leadership group and was the general secretary of the Communist Party of China, right through to the conclusion of the Civil War on the mainland and the declaration of the founding of the People's Republic of China on 1st of October 1949. So the Cultural Revolution, which we're talking about, kicked off in effect, 16, 17 years after the founding of the People's Republic. And part of the concern, and look, there's many interpretations of it, and Linda Javin's book goes into certain aspects of it, go to, internal factional machinations inside the Communist Party, but also concerns about the direction of China itself and whether or not China was losing its way insofar as trying to forge a socialist future. And Mao had the view that what was needed was to continue to agitate for a cultural revolution, a continuous revolution, and class struggle as a way of shaking off the shackles of feudalism and ensuring that the prospects of capitalism finding its way into New China were effectively addressed. So there were concerns that there were parts of the party that favoured policies that would have led to the emergence of capitalism in China, instead of pursuing this pathway of building a socialist country. So I guess that was the potted backdrop to all of this. The Cultural Revolution lasted about a decade, 66 to 76, and the features that it's most known for, particularly for people in the West, was the sort of energy of particularly the youth, the Red Guards, and the way that they turned that energy towards people who they believed were counter-revolutionaries, who were not, upholders of the socialist revolution, and the political violence that emerged from that, the energies that congealed and then released, very much targeted certain kinds of people, people who were intellectuals and people who had familial backgrounds that arguably could be traced back to, families that had a lot of wealth, that were landlords and those sorts of things. So many of the stories that people heard about the Cultural Revolution initially were stories written by intellectuals who suffered during that period. Unsurprisingly, the intellectuals who suffered were also the ones who were most in a position to say something about these experiences. The other aspect of that is that from a Western point of view, and particularly as people look back on it, there is a tendency, and I describe this as a form of liberal Orientalism. So Edward Said wrote a book in the late 70s called Orientalism, which was a critique of the ways in which the West, broadly speaking, framed mainly the Islamic world, right, which was the sort of Near East. So Said was from the Middle East and wrote about that experience and the way in which Western literature mainly framed the Orient, and it framed the Orient in largely romantic terms, which painted a portrait, if you will, that the Near East had a whole bunch of shortcomings, and they related to the fact that it was a little bit barbaric, a bit backward, and really had not yet successfully embarked on this pathway to civilization, which was defined in very liberal terms, which was this idea of the cultivation of individual freedom and understood in a very particular way. So that was Orientalism, broadly speaking, which was a way of viewing that part of the world and the cultures and histories as essentially backward. The Cultural Revolution was viewed in part that way, but I think it was viewed in another dimension as well, and that is that many Western intellectuals had invested a significant amount of hope that China would essentially become a liberal state in Asia. And it didn't do that. And many of those who have a very Western critical view of the Cultural Revolution, and I'll come back to that in a little bit of detail in a moment, also draw heavily on the sort of intellectual traditions that were quite popular in China in the 1910s and 1920s, when Western liberal influences were particularly strong, as Chinese intellectuals sought to find a way of understanding China's own weaknesses during the tail end of the Qing dynasty and think through how it is that China could rebuild itself and not be subjugated to the kind of humiliation that it had experienced in the latter days of the Qing. So they draw on this tradition, and then they lament the fact, basically, that the Communist Party succeeded and that those intellectual traditions were ultimately jettisoned in favor of a form of Sinified Marxism. And the Marxism that took over, I guess, and framed the approach, particularly in the 1950s, was still heavily influenced by the Marxism of the Soviets, but with the Soviet-China split, China then began, I think, in a greater degree of earnesty to explore what Chinese Marxism really meant from the
Yeah.
point of view of China's own ambitions. Anyway, so we get to the Cultural Revolution, and my argument is that the liberal Orientalist lens essentially views the Cultural Revolution as a sorrowful event that should be lamented as an example of China's failure to succeed on this path to liberal modernity and liberal civilization, and that they, in a sense, feel this as a deep sense of loss, right? That China was one that slipped through the fingers. Let's not forget that in the United States in the 1950s, the big debate about China was framed by the question, who lost China?
Right.
So this tradition has been a very dominant part of how the West has viewed the China story. And we even saw it in the 1990s all the way through to the 2010s, when in the end, the question being asked around 2017, 2018 was, has engagement been worth it or not? And the conclusion was again that despite best efforts to civilize China through the introduction of market reforms and opening it up to international trade under American rules, etc., China never became what the Americans, or the West more broadly speaking, believed it could have and should have become. And so once again, China's own experience is criticized as a failure to successfully navigate the path to liberal civilization.
Yeah.
And this particular book, which I think is incredibly well written and certainly I think presents the Cultural Revolution from this particular perspective in, I think, a fairly sensitive way, nonetheless speaks a lot about this genre. And for me, it's the first part of a three-part series, which actually explores how, in fact, Chinese intellectuals, particularly in the last 20 years, have actually reacted against this attempt by the West to frame China's own experiences, including its post-revolutionary experiences, and are now working to reclaim the narratives about China's own history. And the Cultural Revolution is important in this regard because one of the other aspects of the Cultural Revolution was the idea that it would exorcise the vestiges of feudalism that were holding back China's ability to develop in a socialist direction. And so we had the campaigns of Down with the Four Olds. Many people, of course, will talk about how highly energized and activated Red Guards would, destroy temples and historic artifacts, etc. So all of these things are known. But again, those things are kind of lamented in the liberal Orientalist narrative. But from a Chinese point of view, the attack on the olds and the attack on feudalism was part and parcel of an historic process that enabled China as a nation, a new nation, to come to terms with its own history in its own way, through its own terms. So what China, in effect, has been able to do, even if it wasn't by design on day one in 1966, but certainly 40, 50 years later, is that it is now able to address its own history, its dynastic history, the four olds that were subject to the attacks during the 1960s and 70s, in ways where modern China can reappropriate elements of its history, but in ways that make sense for modern China, not in ways that either sort of hold a torch to, this museum that many in the West like to think of China as, and certainly in a way that makes use of China's own heritage for its own modernization purpose. So the Cultural Revolution made it possible, if not by design, certainly by effect, for modern China today to make use of the past in its own terms and to address its own past through its own experiences and its own ambitions, as opposed to being judged through the lenses of this sort of liberal Orientalist lament.
I've always been fascinated on how China is able to maintain itself with this. It's like riding a capitalist bull, but the Communist Party and the state maintaining control of that bull. And one of the most interesting aspects to this is their ability to effectively use it and harness its energies for the benefit of the country, while not necessarily letting it take it over the political structure of that country in the way that, let's say, the West is organized. Pursuant to this, Jimmy Lai, Chinese asset, or let's say U.S. asset, as he's often called, has been convicted, or at the very least has been arrested and convicted, and is expected to serve time in prison over this. Trump apparently is urging Xi Jinping to allow Jimmy Lai to go. But on some level, this goes back to this whole thing of this ability to use, let's say, capitalists and their capability of making resources and money and profit for the benefit of the state without allowing it to take over the state. Like, meaning, if this was Elon Musk would have never been convicted of anything. Whereas in China, they will convict in this case. What is going on with Jimmy Lai? Why was he convicted? And what does it mean that he's been convicted in the larger sense of terms?
Well, Jimmy Lai was charged with a number of counts in relation to sedition, basically under the new national security laws that were passed in Hong Kong. So these were for things that he did after the laws were passed, not for things that he did beforehand. Though obviously there was a lot of continuity between his conduct before the laws were passed and those after he was passed. In short, and I won't go into the detail of the court case, but I'll talk a little bit more about the broader context in a moment. Because the judgment was in the hundreds of pages, and they found that Lai provided unreliable and contradictory testimony. He had barristers obviously representing him, well-financed barristers, I might say. The trial went for 156 days. So if you think of a legal team somewhere in the region of maybe $10,000 to $15,000 US a day, and the trial lasted for 156 days, you get a fair idea as to the financial backing that was behind Lai. It adds up, right? And so, Lai has been found guilty as charged by the judges for charges related to sedition. Lai made it very clear that he saw himself as being engaged in a war against the Communist Party of China and the government of the People's Republic of China. And in seeing himself as a chief flag bearer and a warrior in that fight, he sought to gain the support of the United States government in prosecuting that particular fight in as many domains and against various individuals along the way. And his conduct in that sense, seeking the support of the Americans to prosecute a campaign against the Communist Party of China and the People's Republic of China, by extension, is nothing new. When the civil war on the mainland came to an end at the end of 1949, though of course some of that conflict continued to take place sporadically on the mainland into the early 1950s, and the remnant forces of the Republic of China, under the leadership of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, left the mainland and found themselves on the island of Taiwan. What they sought to do from the island of Taiwan was to rebuild a base and a military capability that would enable them to continue the civil war and take the mainland back. And they did that during the 1950s and 1960s and well into the 1970s. In fact, until 1979, when the United States recognized the People's Republic of China as the only legitimate government of China. So throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Chiang Kai-shek-led Republic of China forces received both the recognition and the support of the Americans. And this involved the provision of arms, and finances, training, which the forces on Taiwan hoped would enable them to counter and fight their way back onto the mainland. Now, during the 50s and 1960s, many folk from the Republic of China government, headquartered in Taipei by then, made their way to the United States and to Washington and all across the United States for that matter, drumming up support, gaining support from members of Congress, raising money, and ultimately securing the endorsement and support of the political classes in the United States as a means of continuing their war against the communists. Jimmy Lai, in that regard, is a continuation of a long line of activists who have been prosecuting this civil war, ever since 1949. So Lai, of course, went to Washington on more than one occasion and sought to enlist the Americans in support of his campaigns. He, of course, gained financial support. His connections with American intelligence agencies, the three-lettered agencies, as they call them, is well known through people who are close to him. And I think what really brought home the fact that he really did see himself as a warrior engaged in a war was two remarks that are well publicized. One was him actually saying that he saw himself as fighting America's war. Okay. And that's an interesting phrase because in 1951, when Senator McCarthy made his famous speech attacking American public officials who worked in the State Department for being communist sympathizers, he reminded people that Chiang Kai-shek was, quote, he's our guy. He is our guy fighting our war. And then he went on to describe what our war was. And our war was the war of the God-backed, God-believing, God-fearing Americans against the godless communists, right? So here's Jimmy Lai today in Washington saying to the Americans, I'm your guy. I'm here fighting your war. And so you really need to get involved in this. And in fact, you have so much power that you can basically wipe the place out by dropping a nuclear weapon. And now, I have seen defenders of Lai sort of say, well, that was just a euphemism. Okay. Well, let's say it was. I don't buy that, but let's say it was just a euphemism. Nonetheless, it was a euphemism that clearly invoked the sense that this was a war, or this is a war, and that he sought to enlist the Americans and whatever the Americans could bring to the table in prosecuting this war. So in that regard, I think the charge of sedition was pretty appropriate. And now the last thing I think your listeners might find interesting, because there was some debate about all of this, and that is that the national security laws, which of course many in the West find absolutely outrageous, is actually very similar to national security laws that just about every country has. It goes to things like treason, sedition, colluding with foreigners to undermine the state and all those sorts of things. And if anybody in any country went about doing things that were treasonous and seditiousness, then it's highly inconceivable that the state would treat them with kid gloves. They'd be treated very, very firmly. So the national security law is in that regard not particularly different from the kind of approaches that exist in many other parts of the world. The other interesting thing about the national security law, Jamal, is that the agreement entered into between the British and China for Hong Kong's return in 1997 actually required Hong Kong to implement its own national security law. It was part and parcel of the agreement. Article 9 from memory, but I might be wrong on that. and Article 21 perhaps. But it was a requirement of the agreement. And in 2003, there was an attempt to pass a national security law, which was thwarted by foreign interference, that drummed up a whole bunch of antagonism towards these national security laws. And the LegCo in Hong Kong dropped them at the time. Now, 15 years later, or thereabouts, they tried again. And that did lead to some pushback, of course, as we know, over the course of the second half of the 2010s. We had a lot of violence and riots, many of which Lai was in favour of, cheered people on, encouraged and egged people on through his publications and words. But eventually these laws were passed, and Lai was charged under those laws, and 3 judges ultimately came to the conclusion in a judgment of well over 500 pages that he was guilty. You're muted, my friend.
Fantastic breakdown of all of it. Absolutely. I always appreciate these conversations, and you gave a really good explanation of all of it. The Mao Zedong Revolution, Warwick, the stealing of the boats, and of Jimmy Lai's conviction that has been hitting the headlines. So I thought I'd ask you about it before we close. Thank you for this, man. Warwick Powell. He is adjunct professor of Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Network Group of Companies, president of Data Integrity and Supply Chains Association, Inc. Warwick, you have a fantastic night, man. Thank you for this. Be safe, okay?
You too. Great to talk to you.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.